Hello, I'm Jessie Gray. Welcome to Personalities. I'm taping this on a Sunday. I've just been to the National Health Federation Convention where I heard a speaker who was extraordinary. His name is Dr. Broda Barnes. He's written several books. We only have one, unfortunately, to show you. It's Hypothyroidism, the Unsuspected Illness. It's published by Crowell. And the subtitle is that low thyroid function may be affecting your body, your emotions, your life. In fact, low thyroid causes fatigue, sensitivity to cold, skin disorders, menstrual disorders, an increased sensitivity to infections, and low blood pressure. That's just a start. I believe that Dr. Broda Barnes, he lives in Colorado, he's just in New York for the convention, is one of the leading experts on thyroid treatment, not only for the symptoms mentioned, but in the use of preventing heart disease and in treating the side effects of diabetes and hypoglycemia. We're very, very fortunate to have him as our guest, and I thank you for coming down here.
Thank you, Jessie. It's a privilege to be here.
It's a privilege to have you.
I would add one thing to your mention of the book. It was published by Crowell, but they have been taken over by Harper and Row now.
They have.
So that if anyone is looking for it, they'll have to get it from Harper and Row.
And it can be ordered, I'm sure.
It can be ordered, and some of the bookstores carry it.
You've also written another book, and it's called The Riddle of Heart Attacks. We don't have that book with us. How could people get that?
They will have to write to me for it. I don't have an outlet in New York yet. This is a paperback on purpose, so it would be cheap enough that anyone could buy it. And as a result of publishing it privately, it also has another advantage. You can choose the title, and the publisher always chooses the title in the hardbound books. They can be obtained by writing to me, and I hope to have outlets in New York before very long for it. They were all grabbed up in a hurry at the meeting this morning, and 120 copies evaporated, and I didn't have one to bring you. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. I have one at home, but of course I didn't know I'd be interviewing you this afternoon. First of all, for people who wouldn't know, what is hypothyroidism? And I guess that's by far more prevalent than hyperthyroidism.
Yes, indeed it is. Hypo means low, as opposed to hyper, which means high. Hypo means underfunctioning of the little gland in your neck. It sits astraddle of your Adam's apple, and if it isn't producing enough of its secretion, your entire body, from your hair to your toenails, will be robbed of circulation, nourishment, and function, so that it represents a deficiency all over the body, not just in the neck where the hormones produce, because hormones are notorious for being circulated all over the body.
Does the thyroid gland also control other glands so that it controls, say, a relay system of glands and their secretions and their hormones?
That is correct. The master gland of the glands of internal secretion is usually called the pituitary, sitting right at the base of your brain. It sends out messages to all of the others, the thyroid, the parathyroids, the pancreas, the adrenals, the sex glands. But in case the pituitary is removed, either by disease or by experimentation, you can duplicate its action by the administration of thyroid alone. This is the only other gland that can substitute for a deficiency in the pituitary. We have no preparations from the pituitary itself, except a very meager quantity that can be obtained from human pituitaries at the autopsy table. But they are in such small supply that we might say, for practical purposes, our only hope, even in pituitary deficiencies, is administration of thyroid.
How many people would you say are suffering from low thyroid conditions and don't know it? What percentage would you say of the normal population? I mean, everybody seems to be exhausted these days. That seems to be the norm.
Well, what is the norm, of course, becomes the question. The number is very high, and it's rising all the time. The reason for this rise, this unusual rise that has occurred since you were a baby, has been due to the removal of many of the infectious diseases. At the turn of the century, killer number one was tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis attacks people, especially younger individuals, from the teens up to 40 to 60. It attacks them largely because they are deficient in thyroid and their resistance is not good enough to ward it off.
You mean most people have always been born that way, but then, of course, due to their low resistance, other diseases have carried them off before
they reached adult life. That's correct. And that represents about 50% of the population.
Why do you think human beings are born so low in thyroid? Why wouldn't we be born with the normal equivalent of what we need?
Yes, well, it harks back to regions across the world where the iodine content in the water and the soil is low. Now, we know that every continent on the globe has these areas, and these particular people came out of those areas as their ancestors did. And it isn't something that disappears with age. It's present. One of them will marry another one, and there's no dilution from it. Now, that sounds silly, doesn't it? To say that one particular individual will be predestined to marry another. Now, that won't work if you meet a young man at a dance one night and get married the next morning. But very clearly, if you have a courtship of any length, if one of them wants to go out at night and be entertained, go to dances and so forth till 2 or 3 o'clock and get up and go to work the next morning, the low thyroid can't handle that rigorous schedule. And very soon he'll pick out a girl that wants to go home early and get their sleep as he does. The highs marry a high, the lows marry a low.
So the personalities that have low thyroid secretions are just scraping through life, and they seem to choose people who do the same, since they can't keep up with those who don't.
That is correct, and their children will have the same ailment, and their parents and grandparents had the same ailment. I've been able to trace some of them back 5 and 6 generations, and know very clearly that the entire family has suffered from a thyroid deficiency.
Now, we'll get more into your whole entire treatment later, but you did say that iodine deficiency is the cause. Does this mean by taking iodine, people can activate their thyroid?
Not today, because it's in the genes over thousands of years, and as a result, supplying the iodine that was deficient before will not correct it today. You do need a little iodine all the time, and that's why iodized salt was introduced in 1919 to prevent the huge goiters that develop in the areas of low iodine, especially in Europe, in America, from Boston, across the Midwestern states, clear up into Seattle. Goiters were the common thing prior to 1919. Now, the goiters disappeared when iodine came in, but the normal thyroid function did not.
You've treated many, many people. I want to pick out a number of diseases, but of course the most prevalent is heart disease, and then let's go into diabetes and also hypoglycemia. You've treated many people for heart disease using thyroid?
Yes, in the prevention of heart disease, because this is the only approach we have at the present time whereby we can prevent the hardening of the arteries that leads to heart disease. This thing is now 100 years old. It was in 1877 that an English physician in London autopsied the first case of a disease that wasn't named yet. It had been recognized a few years before as a clinical entity, but they had no name for it. He found at post-mortem that the thyroid gland had been completely replaced by scar tissue. That, of course, gave it its name. He called it myxedema. Mix for the mucin that was present in the body, and edema for the water that they held on to. This patient was waterlogged before death, and the water was bound very tightly with a mucinous substance. He called in the best chemist in England to see what it was that was holding on to water, and he found that it was mucin. Hence the name myxedema has been with us now for 100 years. But from the standpoint of heart attacks, the importance was this. This patient had far advanced hardening of the arteries all over the body, in the brain, in the heart, in the aorta, in the extremities, in the kidneys, so that that term has now become atherosclerosis. Instead of hardening of the arteries, it's a $10 word for a nickel's worth of hardening of the arteries, and there is where heart attacks are coming from today.
Is these findings been duplicated over and over again?
Many times.
Now you say you can prevent heart attacks. You mean do you think that people with a low thyroid are destined for heart attacks?
They are highly susceptible. This was clearly demonstrated as early as, about 1890. It began when Kocher, a surgeon in Switzerland, found a way to remove the entire thyroid among people who had a large goiter. The goiter was so large it would compress their trachea and they'd actually suffocate. They couldn't get any air in their lungs. Kocher found a means of taking out the entire gland and relieving the pressure on the windpipe. Very soon in Vienna, the great surgeon for stomach operations, we're still using them today. His name slips me at the moment, but it'll come to me in a moment. He repeated this operation, and he had something available the rest of the world didn't. In Vienna at that time, they had a law that if you died in the hospital, you had an autopsy period. They didn't ask them, they did them on every hospital death. And the pathologist told this surgeon immediately that these people from whom he had removed the entire thyroid had rapidly advancing hardening of the arteries or atherosclerosis.
What about people who have already had, say, one heart attack? Can they prevent another heart attack or reduce their chances of getting one?
Let's say it can be delayed. I have many of them at the present time that have had 1 or 2 heart attacks before they were treated, and now the majority are living to the average age of survival, even though they may have had their heart attacks when 30 or 40 years of age.
Can you reverse arteriosclerosis? No.
Unfortunately, no. I have no evidence that we have reversed it, but if we stop the damage, Billroth was the surgeon's name. I told you it'd come to me in a moment. If we stop the damage to the artery where it is, most of them can live out a normal lifespan, and I have some of them now well above the normal death, average age of death of 72 in the female, 71 in the male. I have one in particular who had his first heart attack over 20 years ago, and he's still fishing and playing golf after he retired from his job. He worked out his job as a manager for a company till he was 65, and now in his mid-70s he's having a good time and very happy.
You mentioned this morning that we've heard so much about cholesterol and the cholesterol theory of hardening of the arteries, that eating saturated fats leads to the laying down of those fats in the artery walls, I presume, and I don't know if it's in the veins, just the arteries.
In the arteries.
And that is what is causing increased heart attacks at an earlier age.
There is no question about the damage to the arteries, but the question is, did cholesterol cause it? As a matter of fact, the father of pathology in 1858, on April the 14th, the only reason I remember that is because it's my birthday. I wasn't there at the time. Virchow proved very conclusively that cholesterol did not cause this damage to the heart arteries, that it was pressure in the first place that started a degeneration, then there was an accumulation of fat, and finally cholesterol was laid down, but it was the end point and not the cause.
What diet do you recommend for your heart patients?
I recommend they eat a standard diet that we've eaten for years. If they're a little
Which is what?
Little overweight, I'll recommend that they get in more of the animal fats. That's heresy, isn't it, huh?
You'll recommend more animal fats?
More animal fats and less starch.
Why is this?
Well, I'm a farmer boy, and they used to fatten hogs on corn. That's a starch. And that's the only way you can fatten a hog is on grain, starch of some kind.
But of course hogs aren't meat eaters, right?
They're not meat eaters, but they will if you'll give it to them. And they're so much like the human, it's embarrassing, especially to the hog. Both species will eat anything that doesn't move, and they'll eat too much of it. Their metabolism is very much alike.
Well, you mentioned this morning that you put your patients, of course you were talking about hypoglycemics and diabetics.
Yes.
Does this also apply to the heart patients, that you put them on
Indeed
a high fat, what was it, medium protein and low carbohydrate?
And low carbohydrate is right.
Diet? Do you find that this stops arteriosclerosis when it's used in conjunction with thyroid therapy?
The diet doesn't stop it, but the thyroid does. And this isn't a new idea. Here in New York, many years ago, there was a doctor here who was a heart specialist, and each one of his fat patients were put on a diet consisting of one thing: a half pound of fat meat 3 times a day. Believe it or not.
Was this meat cooked well?
Yes, it can be cooked. It doesn't have to be well. You can have it rare if you're like I am. I'll just cripple a heifer and drive her through, and I'll cut mine off. But Dr. Donaldson, years ago, clearly showed that not only did their hearts improve, but they lost weight at the same time. I have tried eating a half pound of hamburger, nothing else, 3 times a day. I have enough to eat, and I'll lose weight on it.
Now, we've just heard about deaths due to the high-protein liquid diet, but this wouldn't apply to the hamburger because it's high fat and not high protein?
It has a considerable amount of fat in it. The liquid protein diet has practically nothing else in it, and it must, all the protein must be worked into sugar to furnish the body something to eat. This puts a tremendous load on the liver. This is not news because in 1922, Dr. Newberg at the University of Michigan clearly showed that a high-protein diet would damage both the kidneys and the liver, and I suspect, this is conjecture, but I suspect that these deaths from the liquid protein has been due to liver failure.
Does the high-fat diet put a load on the liver?
Not at all, because the fat doesn't have to be worked over into sugar. The high-fat diet, the muscles, the other tissues of the body except the brain, can burn the fat without any alteration, whereas the protein has to be converted into sugar in the liver in order for the body to utilize it.
Can you explain your findings on the relation of hypothyroidism to hypoglycemia? First of all, for those who don't know what hypoglycemia is, a brief explanation of low blood sugar, which...
That's all it means. Hypo means low, and glycemia means sugar. It means that the sugar content of the blood is lower than normal and is causing some symptoms. Now, the symptoms are all related to damage to the brain. If the brain has to have sugar to burn, it can't burn the fat. The other tissues can. And both oxygen and sugar are necessary for normal brain function. In the event you cut off either, as we did when I was in the military, World War II, I was working in the high altitude chamber, and we would demonstrate to the recruits the importance of oxygen. They had to have it every minute. At a simulated altitude of 38,000 feet, one of the recruits would pull his mask off, and in just a few seconds, someone else had to put the mask back on because he was unconscious. He would have died very quickly. On the other hand, if glucose is low and there's no sugar to burn, the damage to the brain is just as devastating.
You call damage, is that permanent? Or is
permanent,
that just...
if it lasts for more than 4 minutes, you'll have some permanent brain damage. If it lasts longer than that, you're going to have a death.
By damage, do you mean what? Very, very low blood sugar, so that the brain is being starved?
The brain is being starved. There's no sugar to oxidize, and function stops.
Now, we've been, all the recent literature on this, and of course the orthodox, I would say the conservative medical profession doesn't even accept that there is such a thing as hypoglycemia. The people who are saying that there is such a thing are divided into 2 camps. One, a high-protein, low-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, and the other, more recent theory that the high-protein diet is damaging, and so they're coming out with a complex carbohydrate diet and a low-protein. You're saying that these diets won't correct hypoglycemia because hypothyroidism is usually or always involved?
I think it's always involved.
You do?
In most cases. Now let's not go quite that far. Let's say 95%. There may be 1% of the hypoglycemias that are due to a tumor of the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. They are rare. In 50 years, only 1,000 of them have been discovered. And that wouldn't go very far to explain our hypoglycemias of today. There is another small group due to damage to the liver. The alcoholic liver that becomes hardened and knobby, filled with scar tissue, will not support the blood sugar, and there will be some more of them. But by and large, the most of them, and they are frequent, probably, I would say certainly 1/3 of our population may suffer from hypoglycemia. One examination on airline pilots recently has shown that 25% of them are involved. Well, our airline pilots are picked out rather carefully for their physical fitness. And if they have it, how much chance do us ordinary folks have?
Well, not only that, but they're flying a plane in which all of us ordinary folks fly. So
Right.
It isn't too reassuring since there is literally a starvation to the brain, and you cannot think clearly no matter how hard you try.
You can't fly an airplane either.
Well, how do you correct hypoglycemia?
Very simply, as a matter of fact, I will change the diet some.
How?
With more fat in it, and I use the fat because it empties out of the stomach slowly. That's your problem. Where hypoglycemia develops, there is no food getting into the bloodstream, no sugar. So with the high-fat diet, the meal will last, instead of an hour and a half, it'll last for 3 hours, that there's a continual supply of sugar coming out into the blood, carried to the liver, and prepared for the tissues. So that'll help. But if the liver is sluggish, then the liver is incapable of converting protein into sugar. And that's what prevents hypoglycemia. The liver stores only enough sugar, or glucose, for about 8 hours at a maximum, which means if you eat your dinner at night at 8, by 4 o'clock the next morning or 2 o'clock the next morning, well, let's say 4 o'clock, you're going to have some sugar formed from protein in the liver, or you're going to have hypoglycemia. And that's where the early hypoglycemias were discovered, was fasting before breakfast. So many people would have a low blood sugar at that time. Now, if we step up the activity of the liver, which we know the thyroid does, then it will furnish sugar from protein as long as there's something around to eat. So that I have 2 points. Number one, a diet that will delay the sugar emptying into the bloodstream so rapidly. Second, some thyroid so the liver can continually produce enough glucose to sustain us until the next meal.
When people have low thyroid, and of course the heart patients you see and the hypoglycemics, and we haven't even talked about the diabetics, we only have 5 minutes left, that isn't a therapy that ends, is it? That continues and continues. You don't correct a thing so that your thyroid then finally functions normally. It's a continual dependency on thyroid therapy.
If you want to remain in health, you'll have to continue your thyroid as long as you live.
Do you think this is the reason why so many people with hypoglycemia try all the diets? They try the desiccated liver, they try the brewer's yeast, they try everything, and nothing works. They're still just dragging around, barely alive.
They are helped some with the high protein diet because there's more protein to be converted into sugar. But if the liver can't do its job, then you're going to have to give it some help with the thyroid. They do drag, there's no question about that.
We only have a few minutes left. How have your theories of thyroid related to heart disease, thyroid related to, and we'll say the side effects of diabetes, which we haven't gotten into, but you mentioned this morning in your lecture, I guess, gangrene, arteriosclerosis, kidney failure.
Yes.
well, everything that we have mentioned, hypoglycemia. How has the organized medical profession accepted these theories?
The practicing physician has accepted it very well. For several years, my wife and I put on exhibits, scientific exhibits at the medical meetings from San Francisco to Boston and from New Orleans to St. Paul, Minnesota. And there, the doctors used what we were doing, they appreciated it, and they carried it out. As far as getting into the textbooks in the Ivory Hall, it hasn't, because the writers of textbooks are not at the scientific meetings. They're doing politics during the meeting instead of learning something. The doctors are using it now from Norfolk, Virginia to Los Angeles and from north to south, but you won't find anything in it in the textbooks
But
yet.
wouldn't you say that still the majority of doctors are not using it?
They're not acquainted with it.
They're not acquainted with it to use it. We have 2 minutes left. The time has just flown. You have a very simple test that someone could do at home, actually, just to find out if they perhaps had a low thyroid condition, hypothyroidism.
Yes. That's the basal temperature test that I described in 1942, and it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. You shake your thermometer down well the night before, place it by the bedside, and after a good night's sleep, upon awakening in the morning, you put it snugly in your armpit, next to the skin, for 10 minutes by the clock. A low thyroid will run a basal temperature, as it's called, below 97.8 degrees. He'll have symptoms of the thyroid deficiency, and if he does, that test is all you need to institute treatment.
But of course, that isn't the test the organized medical profession uses. And if you went and said, hey doc, I put a thermometer under my arm for 10 minutes and my temperature is below 97.8, he'd tell you to get out of his office.
He'd throw you out, that's correct.
So what does the average person do?
You hit the doctor with a ball bat right between the eyes. They listen better then, and tell him to read the book.
You give him the book.
Yes, I'll furnish the book free of charge to any doctor that's interested.
And I must say, we have to wind up the show. We've been talking to Dr. Broda Barnes. The book that we have with us, only one of these written, is Hypothyroidism, the Unsuspected Illness. It's published by Crowell, which is now part of Harper & Row. I'm Jessie Gray. The program is Personalities. Have a very good week.